Welcome to your daily dose of theological German. We are in Tillich's Theology of Culture, number 10 is today's installment. Yeah, last time you'll recall that we did the first half of this sentence here, which we broke at the semicolon because syntactically you kind of have two sentences that are just joined in this way. And so today we're going to take the second half, but before we do, I actually want to revisit something from yesterday because I didn't highlight it, and it is sort of relevant to making sure we understand what is actually being said here, and it might actually even prompt us to think of a slightly different translation. So yesterday we had this kind of final conclusion in the first half of Tillich where he said, thus, it is simultaneously, to greater or lesser extent, the creation or a creation of the circle, sphere, context in which the individual stands. Now, this of this sphere or of the context is a genitive, and I did not actually discuss in any way, shape, or form the question of whether that's a subjective or an objective genitive, which is always a relevant question, but in many cases, it's so obvious that you don't think about it, but actually it's not as obvious in this case as perhaps at first blush, because, well, this is Tillich using the kind of classic ambiguous language. Is he saying that the things we create as concepts within cultural sciences are creations of the context in the sense that the context produces them? Or is he saying that those concepts actually create the context that they're referring to? And to be honest with you, on some level, it's probably both. However, the second option, I think, is quite germane to what we've been reading in all of these sessions on Tillich, because he's been talking about how when you study culture, you create culture. And that's kind of what he thinks is characteristic of the so-called cultural sciences. And so I think this would back that up if we took it to mean, and when you create concepts, you are creating the very sphere in which those concepts have some kind of function. It's not that there's a sphere independent of them, that you create the sphere, you create the context through those things. And so it's kind of circular, which I think is why he uses the term Kreis, which means a circle, really. Anyway, so we're starting to get into a part of Tillich that's a little complicated, and so I'm sorry for kind of going on at length about this before we get into today's translation, but as we look at the second half of this sentence, I just want to sort of give full disclosure that there's aspects of this I'm not even totally getting now, because it's starting to get very, I don't know, philosophical and ambiguous. So I'm going to still go ahead and keep translating until we get to 15 episodes of Paul Tillich. But I just want you to know that I'm going to work through the German and try to help with some German syntax and grammar, etc. But I would sure love to hear comments from anybody that has a better grasp on Tillich than I do as to how we can make the best sense of some of the things that he's saying. And you'll see in today's translation there's a particular word that I think is a struggle in trying to fit it into what Tillich seems to be saying so far about essentially within cultural sciences. He seems to be basically saying that there's really no such thing as objectivity, because you're always creating the sphere that you are analyzing. And so anyway, let's go ahead and get to today's sentence. So a couple of things before we start. I want to just address this word here, Geistigkeit. This is a word that's formed originally, I guess you could say, from the word Geist, which of course means mind or spirit. Then Geist becomes an adjective by adding the ig there, so you get geistig, and then that adjective becomes an abstract noun by adding kite, Geistigkeit. And so this could mean something like spirituality. It could mean mentality, intellectuality. I think for our purposes it's going to be helpful to actually just say way of thinking, which is kind of what intellectuality would sort of imply. So let's go ahead and work our way through this sentence. Da here is a subordinating conjunction, and we're going to translate that as since, and it has this kind of complementing part down here, the zo, da, zo. It's kind of like a since, thus, since, therefore, sort of a construction. Okay, and since this circle or sphere, which is referring back to the essentially the context in which the individual is standing, from the previous sentence from yesterday. Since this context or sphere and its characteristic way of thinking is not without the spheres of thought, let's say, which, now this is a relative pronoun, so that's actually going to be accusative, and it's the subject, or sorry, nominative, and it's the subject of this verb here, which encompass it, and the inventions or creations of other spheres, right, from previous episode, creations of the past on which it rests. Okay, so let's just kind of make sure we're clear about that. Since this sphere and its characteristic way of thinking is not without the spheres of thinking which encompass it and the creations of those spheres of the past on which it rests, thus the most individual, and here you have this ending which tells you this is a superlative adjective, the most individual point of view, standpoint, perspective is firmly embedded in the soil of the, and here I'm just going to say objective, because that is really what that word kind of is there's very few translation options if you look that up in the dictionary. So it's firmly embedded in the soil of the objective, let's say mindset, or even just mind, of the objective mind, the topsoil of every creation of culture. And there again, I think, like from the previous sentence, this is a compound word. Oh, I split it wrong. It's a compound word. And I think it's talking about the process of creating culture. And so I think that's how you should unpack the genitival sense there. The part about this that kind of confuses me, and so this is where I'm really interested to hear from anybody who knows about Tillich. So if you're just here to hear about German grammar, you can tune out and watch tomorrow or next week's videos. But if you want to stick around for an extra couple minutes, this word objective is really, to me, very problematic, because in English, objective means context-free in some sense. And it appears to me that that can't be what Tillich is talking about, because everything we've been reading up until this point, Tillich has been talking about how there's no such thing as context-free when it comes to the cultural sciences. That to understand culture is itself to create culture. And so you can't be context-free because you're creating a context by even trying to be context-free. And so somehow I wonder if Tillich's concept of the unconditional is actually what he means by this term. I haven't read enough Tillich in German to know whether this idea of the unconditional that I've seen in a lot of his English writings or translated writings, I don't know if objective is the German word he is using in those cases. But in any case, somehow objective in the sense that we use in English of context-free just doesn't really work to me. And so I would sure love to hear it in the comments from anybody that has studied Tillich more in depth than I have, to give us some insight about what he might be saying here, and if that would give us perhaps a different way to translate even this word that's not the English word objective. Thanks for sticking around if you're still listening, and we'll see you next week.